Hi everyone! Welcome back to my channel. Today we are doing a recent reads wrap-up, and there are a lot of books I've read in the past couple months while I was taking an unexpected break from BookTube. So I'm actually splitting up these wrap-ups so that the videos aren't too long. There aren't so many books I have to go over. It's not so overwhelming. So these are all of the books that I read around Halloween time. So you will see that a lot of these are spooky reads, darker reads, which was what I was feeling in the mood for at the time. And we're going to go in the order of my enjoyment. So starting with the book I enjoyed the least, all the way up to my favorite book of this wrap-up. I do have one DNF that we will start with, and that is It Rides a Pale Horse by Andy Marino. This is one I received for a review from Orbit and was a dark horror book that sounded really good from the premise. It says, a terrifying novel of obsession, creation, and the shocking actions we'll take to protect those we love, all set in a small town filled with dark secrets. So kind of the vibe of this one was something I was really looking for around Halloween time, and unfortunately it was 100% the writing style that just was not connecting with me at all. I got probably around 50 to 60 pages in and just realized that I wasn't retaining any of the information. I kept glazing over, thinking about other things while I was reading this book. The writing style really just didn't work for me. It was quite flowery, quite poetic, and I'm just not a reader that loves those types of writing styles. So even though I think that this could work and the premise sounded so good, unfortunately, this one was just not for me solely because of the writing style. Not that it was bad, it just wasn't my personal preference. And then the books that I finished, starting with my least favorite, but all of these were 4 stars and above. So none of these I disliked. I actually really enjoyed all of them. I had a really good wrap up around October. So the first one I will talk about is One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. This one is a dark fantasy, kind of has a gothic tone to it. And this one for me, I loved the premise of it. The magic was really, really interesting in this one, and I really liked our main character. I just thought it read a little bit younger than what I was expecting. Like the dialogue between characters read very young, and the romance subplot I found myself not really caring about. So even though this one is one that I had a lot of fun with while I was reading it, it was very easy to read, very easy to keep coming back to, and while I was reading it, I was enjoying it. It didn't stick around with me very much. I don't remember a ton from this book. I just remember thinking, oh, this is a little younger than I would have expected, given that it's marketed as adult fantasy at least. So I definitely think that if you're a YA reader, you might actually really enjoy this one, and I would highly recommend checking it out. For me though, I still really enjoyed it. I might pick up the sequel, we'll see. I'd probably have to reread this one before I picked up the sequel, and that might not happen, so maybe not, but I still enjoyed it while I was reading it. It just didn't really stick around with me, so I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed it while I was reading it, but it's not a new favorite. The next book I have to talk about is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. I am trying to make my way slowly through all of Stephen King's backlist, and these new editions came out and I'm getting them on Blackwell's, and I love how when you line up all these editions, they make like a rainbow spine. It's so cool. So I'm making my way through all of the old stories in these editions, and Salem's Lot was next. It's one that I've had on my TBR forever. I think it's not his first book published, but one of his very first books published. I know Carrie's the first. So I think Salem's Lot might be second or third. So it's a very, very early novel from Stephen King, and I really enjoyed this one. I always think Stephen King's character work is really well done. I will say it took me a while to get into this one. The beginning of this one was quite slow, and it took a while for the horror elements to show up. If you don't know, this is a vampire horror novel, so if you like vampires, especially really scary vampires, this is a good one because it definitely had a lot of the scary terrifying vampire vibes I was looking for, and I was genuinely shocked at some of the stuff that happened in this book and happened to some of our characters. I really enjoyed it, and I really liked the ending. I remember the epilogue, or the last chapter, being very, very like creepy, impactful. So I really like this. I really like Stephen King's writing style. I find myself sometimes intimidated by it because it does take a while for me to get into his books. But then when I'm oriented in the characters' lives and know what's going on, that's when I really start to pick up my enjoyment for it. So this wasn't my favorite Stephen King. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars because of how slow that beginning was and how long it took to kind of get going. But once we did, I was fully in for the ride. I had a really good time with it. So 4 out of 5 stars for this one. All right, and then the next book I have is The Invited by Jennifer McMahon. So this is a horror novel that I think is a little less horror. I think it's more mystery to me. And even though the cover screams horror, do not go into this one thinking you're going to get a ton of horror elements, paranormal elements. There is a slightly different twist on a haunted house in this book. It follows a couple who is building their own home and is new to this town, kind of as a fresh start for them. And as they're building their home, they're selecting things to put in their home from history that have a very dark past. And so you're kind of realizing that they're almost building their own haunted house. And I really liked that twist on the classic haunted house story. I thought it was really unique and unlike any other book I've read like this. So I loved that part of it. And then the focus of the story I found was a lot more on the history of this town and these characters and kind of the mystery of what happened in the past that our main character in the present day is trying to solve. So it wasn't as much of a focus on the paranormal elements as I was expecting. I was hoping for a little bit more of that from this book, but I still actually really found myself enjoying the historical mystery aspect of it, even though that's not what I was expecting going into this one. So I think if you have the right expectations, you could really enjoy this one. I just wouldn't say it is a like classic horror haunted house story because the focus is so much more on that mystery from the past. So I highly recommend this one. I picked up The Winter People shortly after finishing this one because I really liked Jennifer McMahon's writing style and found it very easy to fly through these pages. So I'm curious to check out more of her works, and I know The Winter People is, I think, her most popular, so I'm excited to get into that one. And then I think I already said this, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. All right, getting into the books that I loved. So starting with a 4.5 star book, so almost a new favorite, but not quite, and that is Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. This one I picked up because I saw my friend Elle over from Elliott Brooks absolutely love this, and she talked a lot about the humor in the book, and I can totally see why a lot of people, including her, love it. I really, really liked the tone of this book, and it was not what I was expecting going in. So I would say this is a dark fairy tale, and it's very much told in that classic fairy tale way, but the lighthearted kind of humor and tone that's sprinkled throughout really made this one so much fun to read, and I found myself constantly wanting to pick it back up whenever I put it down. The only thing I will say that kind of dropped the enjoyment level for me slightly was the main character. I thought was just a little too naive. She is a full-grown adult. I think it's said that she's around 30 years old in the text, but she acts much younger than her age, and there's a reason for it, and I can definitely understand the reasoning behind it, but there were times where I was like, really? Like, she was so naive about things that sort of contradicted some of the stuff that she has gone through in the past. So some of the stuff I was like, okay, this is a little far-fetched that she would act this particular way. So the main character had some things that kind of like took away from the enjoyment just a little bit, like took me out of the story just a little bit. But overall, like the sidekicks that she picks up along the way in this journey, it's about her trying to save her sister from this abusive relationship, and the people and creatures that she encounters on her way to do that are so much fun, and I loved that part of it so much that this was still such a fun ride. And by the end, I was smiling and absolutely loved it, and definitely want to pick up more from T. Kingfisher. If the main character hadn't done a couple things or hadn't acted certain ways and it hadn't pulled me out of the story, this could have been a new favorite, but just that one thing kind of held it back a little bit. So I'm so curious to pick up more T. Kingfisher now, though, because the writing style in this one was what really made it so much fun for me. All right, and then I've got 2 5-star books. So starting with the first book I'll talk about, and it's hard to rank them because they're so different, which you're about to find out. It is the final book in the Ryaria Revelations series. So I know that this bind-up has 2 books in it. I'm just talking about Percepliquis in this particular wrap-up. So I think I had talked about the previous book in this bind-up in another wrap-up. But Percepliquis is the final book, the 6th book in this series, and I think it was my favorite. It was so good, and even though I saw a lot of the reveals coming, I saw a lot of the twists ahead of time because I've read the prequel series, Legends of the First Empire, before I read this one, it still was so much fun going through those twists and reveals with the characters that it still was a really good time. And I love these characters in this book, not quite as much as Legends, but I still really, really love the characters in this book. I thought that there were some emotional beats in this particular book that I found were reminiscent of some of the emotional gut punches in Legends, more so than any of the other books I've read in this particular series so far. So I really like the way Michael J. Sullivan writes his very emotional scenes. I think he does that so well, and there were a couple that really hit hard in this particular book. So I really enjoyed this conclusion. I gave it 5 stars. I think looking back, Ryaria Revelations is a great, great series. I think probably overall it's still a 5-star series for me, but I don't know if it's a new favorite because I kept comparing it unfairly to Legends of the First Empire, which is like an all-time favorite series for me, and it doesn't quite live up to that particular series for me, mostly because the characters. I love the characters in Legends, and if I were to say which you should read first, I would say you should actually read Ryaria Revelations first before reading Legends of the First Empire, because I think the reveals and the twists that happen at the end of this series will be so much more impactful and fun and surprising if you haven't read Legends. Legends kind of gives away some of the twists in this series, and even though having read Legends first, it was so much fun picking out the Easter eggs and seeing like the historical inaccuracies of the lore in this world, like many, many years after Legends. That was so much fun to pick out, but I think I would have enjoyed this series more had I not known what the reveals were going to be at the end. So that is my advice, but of course you can do whatever you want. I read Legends first and I still love both series, so at the end of the day, it's up to you and what you want to do, but that is my advice. So I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. This entire bind-up was 5 out of 5 stars for me, my favorite in the series. And then finally, my favorite book of this particular wrap-up was Home Before Dark by Riley Sager, which, unlike The Invited, I will say that this one is much, much more focused on the paranormal aspects. And even though I wouldn't necessarily classify it as horror, I think this is more thriller. The way it's told is so clever, and it's following this family that published this book about their experiences living in an alleged haunted house. So you're getting point of view chapters as if you're reading from the book that was published by the family, but then it switches to point of view chapters of the daughter of this family who's trying to actually figure out whether or not the book that they published is factual. So the way it's told is so clever, and I loved the book within a book aspect of it so much. I would say the book that was published that you're getting to read from reads more horror, but then the point of view chapters from the daughter reads more thriller because she's trying to figure out the actual mystery behind this house. So I loved this. I loved this so much. I found it such a great balance between mystery and the fun paranormal stuff that I go to these books for. I love those types of creepy ghost stories so much, and I just thought the pacing of this one, I could not put it down. I loved it. This is my favorite Riley Sager by far so far. So I think if you really like haunted house stories, this is a really clever one, the way it's told. And you may, I don't know how people feel about the ending of this one. I really liked it. Again, I think that this is fantastic, so 5 out of 5 stars for me. Those are all of the books I read around Halloween time. So I had a lot of spooky stories and darker fantasy stories on this list. Have you read any of the books that I talked about today? What did you think of them? I would love to know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you'd like to, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye.